At 6:14 a.m., on June 12, 1942, over the northern coast of Luzon, the sky was already burning. Tracer rounds streaked across the pale morning clouds like red lightning. A Grumman Wildcat twisted through the chaos, engines screaming, oil spraying across its canopy. Under its left wing, something didn't belong, a rough metal tube, bolted on with tractor brackets and wrapped in wire. Lieutenant Ray Doyle had never seen anything like it. His squadron called it the farmer's pipe, a ridiculous field mod dreamed up by a rice farmer who once fixed irrigation pumps for a living. Nobody expected it to work. But right now, Doyle didn't care about ridicule. 3 Japanese Zeros were closing from the sun, 50 yards and diving fast. He pushed the throttle forward. The Wildcat shook under the strain, wings flexing as bullets punched holes through the fuselage. The homemade launcher beneath his wing hissed from air pressure, a sound like a kettle boiling over. "Come on, you stupid thing," Doyle muttered. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The first Zero flashed across his nose. He flipped a toggle switch wired into the cockpit panel, a piece of scrap radio trigger the farmer had built from spare parts. The launcher fired with a deafening pop. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, the air itself seemed to explode. A cloud of shrapnel and compressed debris burst upward like a shotgun blast. The lead Zero flew straight into it. Its right wing ripped apart. Fire engulfed the plane before it could roll away. "Holy hell!" the gunner shouted over the radio. "Did that just—" "It worked," Doyle cut in. "The damn pipe worked." He banked hard, smoke curling past his cockpit glass. The 2 remaining Zeros broke formation, scattering in confusion. Doyle's heart hammered in his chest. For the first time in weeks, an American fighter had turned the tables. Below, in a hidden workshop beside the rice paddies, the farmer who built the strange contraption was tightening another bolt, unaware that his stupid idea had just changed the air war forever. By late June 1942, the skies over Luzon had become a hunting ground for Japanese fighters, a theater of smoke and ash that never truly cleared. Every dawn began the same way, the distant hum of engines, then the growing roar of Zeros descending through the morning haze like metallic predators searching for anything that moved. The few American and Filipino pilots still alive flew patched-up aircraft, held together with scrap wire, radiator clamps, and faith. Their airfields were little more than strips of scorched dirt surrounded by palm trees and burned-out trucks. For months, the raids had come without mercy. Villages vanished beneath bomb craters, convoys turned into twisted iron, and the rice paddies that once fed thousands were carved into trenches by exploding shrapnel. Civilians ran, but there was nowhere to hide. The sky itself had become the enemy. Each failed defense felt like proof that nothing improvised could stand against Japan's industrial precision. Every mechanic, every pilot, every farmer who stayed behind knew that logic said resistance was hopeless, and yet they resisted anyway. Among them was a man named Domingo Ramos, a farmer who had never flown, never held a rifle, but knew machinery like a second language. Before the invasion, he had repaired irrigation pumps for the coastal plantations, working with rusted pipes, leaky valves, and hand-forged fittings. When the war came, his fields filled with smoke, his equipment with bullet holes, and his friends with despair. But when he looked at the wreckage of fallen planes scattered across the hills, he didn't see defeat. He saw usable parts. The local guerrilla network began salvaging everything they could find: control rods, fuel hoses, and half-melted metal from destroyed aircraft. What they couldn't use as weapons, they melted into tools. What they couldn't fix, they studied. Every night, men like Domingo sat under dim lantern light, tracing the shapes of torn fuselage panels, trying to understand how something so delicate could carry so much power. He became obsessed with the idea that the sky could be fought with air itself, not bullets or rockets, but compressed pressure. The American station nearby called him the Pump Man, half joking, half admiring his stubbornness. When they ran out of spare parts, he offered them the valves from his irrigation system. When the generator failed, he wired it to a bicycle crank. His hands were always black with grease, his shirt stiff with dried oil, but his eyes carried the calm of a man who refused to surrender to reason. By July, his workshop looked like a graveyard of machines, shattered propellers stacked against bamboo walls, engine casings used as anvils, hoses curling like snakes across the floor. Above the workbench hung a hand-drawn diagram, copied from memory the airflow path of a Zero during its attack dive. Domingo had sketched arrows showing how pressure built under the wing and dispersed around the fuselage. Next to it he drew a rough outline of a pipe angled upward, capped with a valve, and connected to a small air tank. Beneath the sketch, in careful handwriting, he wrote 3 words in Tagalog: hangin, laban, hangin, air against air. To the guerrillas, it looked like madness. To Domingo, it was geometry. If he could time the pressure release to fire as a Zero swooped low, the blast might scatter shrapnel and debris upward with enough force to damage an engine. The idea sounded childish, even suicidal, but it was the first thing that made sense after months of hopeless defense. The commander laughed when he showed the drawing, but gave him permission anyway. "If you're crazy enough to try," he said, "then maybe you're crazy enough to make it work." And so, in a war ruled by speed, altitude, and industrial might, a rice farmer, armed with plumbing tools, began designing a weapon that would one day make pilots believe in miracles again. The manuals written in Washington and Manila were clear: when outnumbered in the air, climb high, dive fast, and never turn with a Zero. Those words, printed in black ink on fading paper, had guided every pilot and mechanic who still clung to hope in the Pacific theater. Yet on the front lines, the theory dissolved like smoke. The Japanese A6M0 wasn't just a plane, it was a scalpel in the hands of a surgeon who knew exactly where to cut. It could climb twice as quickly as a Wildcat, roll tighter, and slice through turns that left heavier aircraft wallowing in the sky like wounded whales. Every engagement ended the same way: the Zero behind, the American ahead, the gunfire brief and terminal. Domingo had listened to the pilots describe the encounters at night, their hands sketching invisible arcs in the air as they spoke. They said it felt like the sky itself betrayed them, like the controls turned sluggish just when survival depended on speed. Mechanics complained that their guns jammed, their engines overheated, and their ammunition belts tore under stress. But beneath all that frustration was a single truth: even perfect machines lost when they followed perfect rules. The manuals didn't account for terrain, wind, or the unpredictable rhythm of survival. They didn't account for fear. When Domingo examined the wreckage scattered across the rice fields, he saw the same patterns repeating again and again. The holes in the fuselages formed lines, not clusters. The bullets always struck from above and behind, where the Zero's dive path intersected with the rising thermals of the valley. The Americans were fighting a vertical war with horizontal thinking. They waited to engage. The enemy attacked while descending, gaining speed and precision that made counterfire almost useless. Domingo realized the problem wasn't just tactics, it was timing. The Zero pilots had mastered gravity itself. At night, lying awake in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, he imagined the sky as a map of invisible currents, pressure lines rising and collapsing like tides. He understood that bullets were only fast because they rode those same currents, and that anything light enough to follow them could, in theory, strike upward just as quickly. He couldn't explain it with equations, but he could feel it, the way a mechanic feels when an engine hums out of balance. It wasn't the weapon that failed, it was the way they used it. Every day he watched the remaining Wildcats scramble to intercept bombers, and every day they returned fewer in number. He knew that when the enemy came low enough to strafe the airfields, the defenders' machine guns couldn't elevate fast enough to meet them. The angle was all wrong. The guns pointed forward, the planes attacked from above. The defenders were trapped inside geometry they hadn't designed. And so, no matter how brave or skilled the pilots were, they fought a battle dictated by math, and math always won. Domingo didn't have charts or instruments, only instinct sharpened by years of coaxing water through bent pipes and misaligned valves. He began to wonder whether air itself could be used as a weapon, whether the pressure that kept his crops alive could also push back against the force that kept his people afraid. The question seemed foolish, almost sacrilegious in the face of so much suffering. But the longer he studied the wreckage, the more convinced he became that the solution wasn't in better guns or faster planes. It was in the overlooked physics of desperation, the small, invisible forces that everyone else ignored. By the time the sun rose on July 3rd, Domingo had stopped reading manuals altogether. He believed that survival didn't belong to those who followed instructions, but to those who rewrote them. And in a war where logic had already failed, madness might be the only rule left worth following. The first time Domingo watched a Wildcat fall, it came down in silence, its wings sheared apart like paper burning in the wind. The plane spiraled once, then twice, before it vanished into the palm groves north of San Fabian. leaving only a plume of black smoke curling into the morning haze. He remembered the name of the pilot, Lieutenant Doyle, the same man whose laughter had filled the camp only the day before. There was no explosion, no heroic last radio message, only the distant crack of impact and the quiet that followed. The men nearby stopped speaking, as if the air itself had frozen. That summer, silence became a language everyone understood. Each dawn began with the same sequence: engines coughing to life, boots pounding on the dirt runway, a burst of hope climbing into the sky, followed by the inevitable sound of gunfire fading into nothing. They counted the minutes until the planes returned, and when they didn't, they packed away the mugs of cold coffee and stared at the horizon. There was always one more name to cross off the roster, one more locker to clear, one more letter to write home without knowing what to say. Domingo helped collect the wreckage after every raid. He learned to tell which pilots had tried to fight and which had never seen the attack coming. The difference was in the angle of the impact and the way the cockpit glass shattered. He found fragments of dog tags among the twisted aluminum, bits of leather gloves, a half-melted compass, still pointing north. Sometimes, when the bodies were too broken to carry, they buried the wreckage instead, marking the spot with a propeller blade driven into the soil like a cross. The heat from the crashes left the ground warm for days. The farmers nearby had stopped planting rice because the bomb craters filled the fields with salt water. The children no longer ran toward the sound of aircraft. They hid under overturned carts, covering their ears until the sky went quiet again. The local priests stopped ringing the church bells because the Japanese pilots used the sound to locate villages. Every part of life that once belonged to the earth now answered to the air. And each new raid reminded Domingo that gravity itself had become a curse. Everything that rose eventually fell, and everything that fell was human. He remembered one afternoon when a column of smoke drifted so high, it blotted out the Sunday. The air smelled of fuel and wet soil, and a low mechanical drone trembled through the valley. In the distance, a line of Zeros was diving on the last airfield still capable of launching planes. The defenders fired until their barrels melted, their bullets tracing hopeless arcs into the sky. When the attack ended, the runway was gone, and the pilots who survived walked among the flames, their faces blank, their hands trembling without weapons to hold. That night, Domingo sat beside the wreck of a transport truck and watched the fire die out across the horizon. The sky above him flickered red, as if the war itself was burning through the clouds. He thought of the irrigation canals he once tended, the water he had guided so carefully through the fields. He wondered if air could be guided the same way, harnessed, shaped, redirected to push back against the force that kept crushing them from above. The idea still sounded foolish, but after so much loss, foolishness felt like the only thing stronger than fear. When dawn came, the fields were silent except for the faint crackle of cooling metal. Domingo walked among the ruins, his boots sinking into ash and mud, and he realized that the war no longer belonged to the soldiers who fought it. It belonged to the men who refused to accept that destruction was inevitable. Somewhere beyond the smoke, he decided, there had to be a way to make the sky bleed back. Domingo's workshop became his battlefield, a place where the noise of hammers replaced the sound of gunfire, and every spark felt like defiance against the sky. He spent nights crouched beside the shell of a burned generator, tracing his fingers along the scorched metal to understand how heat, pressure, and resistance moved together. To anyone else, it was junk. To him, it was evidence. The Japanese planes were not invincible. They were vulnerable to the same laws of physics that made his irrigation pumps work. If air could carry destruction downward, then air could also throw it back. He began experimenting with pipes scavenged from wrecked aircraft, connecting them to the pressure tanks salvaged from abandoned tractors. Each night he adjusted valves, checking the hiss of compressed air, feeling for the rhythm that told him when the flow was right. It reminded him of tuning a pump on the farm, when too little pressure meant the water stalled, and too much could burst the line. The principle was the same. Energy built up inside a confined space, waiting for release. The trick was to make that release happen at the exact moment of danger. Domingo's first design was laughably crude, a short steel tube welded to a valve handle, its end wrapped with scrap copper for sealing. The plan was to fill it with shrapnel nuts, bolts, and bits of ball bearings, then blast it upward using compressed air when a Zero came low for a strafing run. It wasn't meant to destroy, only to disrupt. If he could throw debris into the enemy's propeller arc, the pilot might flinch, break formation, or even clip a blade. The idea seemed harmless enough, until he explained it to the guerrilla commander. The man stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "You want to fight aircraft with plumbing?" he asked, half laughing. Domingo nodded, serious. It's not plumbing, he said quietly. It's air fighting air. The commander sighed. And what happens when your pipe explodes? What happens when you die for a theory? Domingo didn't answer, because he already knew the risk. Every invention worth building carried a cost. But what choice was left when the manuals and the experts had all failed? He faced another obstacle just as deadly as disbelief: the scarcity of materials. Every piece of steel was already claimed for rifles, trucks, or reinforcement plates. Even scavenging was dangerous, since Japanese patrols executed anyone caught near wreckage. Domingo worked by moonlight, hiding his tools under sacks of rice during the day. He learned to weld using the fuel from broken lanterns, and to test pressure with his bare hands. His arms were covered with small burns, his palms lined with cuts, but he refused to stop. By August, his crude air cannon stood in the center of the barn, gleaming dully in the lantern light. It looked more like a child's toy than a weapon, short, uneven, its joints sealed with wax and wire. Yet when he pulled the valve, the sudden burst of air cracked like a whip and left a dent in the roof. The sound made the other men flinch. One of them spat on the ground and muttered, "It will kill him before it kills the enemy." Domingo only smiled. "Maybe," he said, "but it will kill something." The next step was the hardest, convincing a pilot to test it. Most refused outright, calling it suicide, and none of the commanders wanted to waste a working aircraft on an unproven device. The last surviving mechanic, an American sergeant named Harlan King, finally agreed to help, if only out of curiosity. Together, they mounted the launcher under the wing of a Wildcat whose landing gear barely held together. When the fittings didn't align, Domingo cut them himself, hammering bolts into shape with the heel of his boot. The final weld smelled of burning oil and salt. As dawn approached, he stood back and looked at what they had built, a contradiction made of rust and faith. The weapon had no name, no manual, no approval, but it was real, and it worked in theory. Whether it would work in the sky was another matter. Domingo wiped the soot from his hands, listening to the faint hum of distant engines approaching from the east, and whispered to himself, "If they don't believe the sky can be broken, then let's prove it wrong." The first test flight took place on a morning so clear it almost felt like mercy, the kind of blue that made men believe the war was far away. The Wildcat sat trembling at the end of the makeshift runway, its paint blistered, its propeller blades pitted from sand and time. Domingo stood beside the wing, one hand pressed against the cool metal, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the engine warming up. The cannon, his cannon, hung beneath the left wing like a mistake nobody wanted to admit existed. To the pilots watching from the shade of a broken hangar, it looked absurd, almost comical, a piece of farm equipment welded to a fighter plane. Sergeant Harlan King climbed into the cockpit with a cigarette still burning between his lips, muttering something about dying for science. He was the only man reckless enough to trust a weapon designed by someone who didn't even know how to fly. The engine roared, shaking the ground as it built speed. Domingo stepped back, shielding his face from the dust, his heart thudding in rhythm with the propeller. For a moment, it felt as though every noise in the valley was counting down to something irreversible. Then the Wildcat lurched forward, leaving a trail of black smoke and defiance behind it. The radio crackled as King's voice came through, faint but steady. "Climbing to 500 feet, he said, and the watchers below exhaled as one. The sky swallowed the plane, reducing it to a speck moving against the Sunday. Domingo's hands clenched unconsciously, tracing invisible lines in the air as he pictured the mechanism, engaging valve open, pressure release, air burst. Nothing could prepare him for what came next. A deep metallic pop echoed through the distance, followed by a brief flash near the left wing, then silence. The radio hissed once, twice, before King's voice returned, breathless and laughing. "It didn't explode," he shouted, but something definitely happened. When the plane landed, its landing gear wobbling like tired legs, the men crowded around it with equal parts relief and disbelief. The launcher was blackened, the tip slightly bent, but intact. The air valve had jammed half open, firing too soon and releasing the blast before it could build full pressure. Still, a fragment of metal had torn through a weather balloon that had been floating 100 feet above the field, accidental proof that the cannon worked in principle. King climbed down from the cockpit, grinning through a layer of soot. "You're lucky, farmer," he said, slapping Domingo's shoulder. "It's stupid as hell, but maybe stupid's what we need." The laughter that followed wasn't mockery this time. It was relief, a crack of light in months of darkness. Word spread quickly through the camp, and soon every mechanic wanted to see the contraption that had survived its own madness. Domingo spent the following nights refining the design, adding a second valve and reinforcing the barrel with steel cut from a destroyed fuel drum. He borrowed pressure gauges from the Americans, learned how to adjust the regulator using the whine of the air as his guide, and painted a single phrase along the side of the launcher in chalk, "For those who fell." The second test came 2 days later, under the threat of another raid. This time, Domingo insisted on triggering the mechanism himself, crouched beneath the wing, while King sat ready to take off. When the alarm sirens wailed from the hills, a squadron of Zeros descended low, their engines screaming like angry hornets. Domingo waited until the shadows passed overhead, then pulled the lever. The cannon fired with a roar that ripped through the morning stillness. The recoil knocked him backward, but above him, one of the Zeros wobbled violently, its formation breaking apart. A fragment of debris glittered in the sunlight before tumbling downward like a slow confession of gravity. When silence returned, Domingo sat on the ground, his ears ringing, his face streaked with dust and sweat. He didn't know if the plane had crashed, or if his weapon had simply startled the enemy, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that, for the first time since the occupation began, the men on the ground had made the sky flinch. That night, as the others celebrated with weak coffee and stronger laughter, Domingo walked back to his workshop and stared at the dented barrel glowing faintly in the lamplight. It was ugly, dangerous, and probably insane, yet somewhere deep inside, he knew it was also right. The morning after the second test, the valley smelled of burnt oil and wet grass, a strange mixture of victory and disbelief hanging in the air. Domingo slept beside the Wildcat, his back against the wheel, his ears still ringing from the blast. When he woke, the others were already gathered around the launcher, poking at it with wrenches and sticks as if it were some wounded animal that might bite if touched too quickly. Sergeant King stood nearby, a mug of black coffee in hand, shaking his head with a grin that wavered between amusement and pride. "You almost blew my tail off," he said, his voice rasping from smoke. "But damn if it didn't scare them." Domingo examined the barrel, running his fingers along the warped edge where the pressure had buckled the steel. The welds had held, but barely. The valves were fused shut. The copper seals melted into strange, glassy shapes. By any normal standard, the test was a failure, a weapon that worked once and broke itself in the process. Yet as the men argued about its design, their voices rising and overlapping, something had changed. The laughter was real this time, not cruel but alive, a sound they had almost forgotten they could make. By noon, the commander came to see the wreck for himself. He arrived with the usual skepticism of a man who had buried too many soldiers for jokes. But the sight of a dozen mechanics gathered around a bent pipe softened his expression. "So this is the famous cannon?" he asked. Domingo nodded, wiping grease from his hands. "Not famous yet," he said quietly. The commander crouched, inspecting the cracks, then stood and crossed his arms. "You realize," he said, "if this thing explodes in the air, it will take the pilot with it." Domingo looked at him without blinking. "Then we build it stronger," he replied. That night, while the others rested, he worked alone under the dim lantern glow, hammering new sheets of metal onto the damaged barrel. He scavenged bolts from the engine of a wrecked truck, stripped the copper wire from radio coils, and used the melted fragments from the previous launcher to form a thicker base plate. The workshop filled with the rhythmic clatter of tools, a metallic heartbeat echoing through the walls. Every strike of the hammer was a small act of rebellion, a way of telling the universe that failure did not end, a man's silence did. On the third day, he tested the air valve again, this time using a hand pump instead of the tractor compressor. The hiss was steady, clean, a sound that felt almost musical to him now. He timed the release carefully, counting seconds under his breath, and when the valve opened, the air burst through with a deep, satisfying thud that rattled the walls but didn't destroy them. Domingo smiled for the first time in weeks. The design could be saved. It only needed patience and precision. When the next raid warning came, the men gathered instinctively around the half-repaired plane, ready to run or fight, but Domingo stayed kneeling beside the launcher, his hands steady on the valve. The sirens wailed across the hills, and he felt the air pressure rising inside the barrel, the faint tremor of stored energy begging to be released. At the last second, the commander shouted for him to get clear, but Domingo didn't move. He pulled the lever, and the cannon fired again, louder, sharper, cleaner. This time, the recoil didn't knock him back. The pipe didn't split. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. The Zeros overhead broke formation once more, startled by the sudden blast. One peeled away sharply, trailing smoke from its left wingtip. It might have been coincidence, luck, or fate, but to the men below it felt like vindication. They didn't cheer, they simply stared upward, listening to the echo fading into the hills. Domingo lowered his hands slowly, the smell of hot metal filling his lungs. The weapon still wasn't perfect. It could barely be called safe, but it worked well enough to make the enemy hesitate. That night, as rain began to fall over the valley, Domingo sat beneath the roof of the workshop and listened to the drops striking the corrugated steel. For the first time, the rain didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like breathing rough, uneven, but alive. And somewhere in the rhythm of that rain, he realized that sometimes survival wasn't about winning quickly or building perfectly. It was about refusing to stop fixing what everyone else had already buried. By the first week of September, the weapon had evolved from a farmyard experiment into something resembling a real instrument of war. The reinforced barrel gleamed with layers of blackened steel, and the valve system had been replaced with twin regulators scavenged from an old oxygen tank. It no longer looked like an accident. It looked deliberate, even menacing. Domingo stood beside it on the airstrip as dawn bled across the horizon, watching Sergeant King check the fittings one last time. Neither of them spoke. They both knew that the day's test would not be another demonstration, it would be a battle. The Japanese had intensified their raids, sending bombers escorted by fighters that dove low to strafe the runways. The defenders had little left to fight with. Half their planes were grounded, and their ammunition was running out, so the farmer cannon, as the soldiers now called it, became their last trick. They mounted 2 launchers under the wings of the Wildcat, balancing them with sandbags to keep the aircraft from yawing. It was crude, dangerous, and entirely against every regulation ever written. But rules no longer mattered in a war measured in seconds. At 7:03 a.m., the sirens began. The sound rose over the valley like a mechanical scream, warning everyone that the sky was coming apart again. King climbed into the cockpit, his face streaked with dust and oil. Domingo stood clear of the wings, shouting through the noise that the air pressure was steady, the valves tight, and the fuses dry. King gave him a small nod, a gesture too quick to be called courage but too deliberate to be fear. The engine roared to life, and the Wildcat rolled forward, its shadow cutting across the cracked earth like a blade. As the plane lifted off, the first formation of Zeros appeared from the east, glinting silver against the morning Sunday. Domingo watched them weave into attack lines, their movements so precise they seemed choreographed. He counted 7 fighters, maybe 8, diving in perfect formation toward the field. The anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, but their tracers fell short, curving uselessly into the clouds. King's Wildcat climbed through the chaos, the improvised cannons rattling against the fuselage. Over the radio, his voice came through steady and low. Approaching range, pressure at mark, firing in 3. Then came the sound, a deep, violent crack that rolled across the sky like thunder striking metal. The first cannon fired cleanly, expelling a burst of shrapnel and debris into the oncoming formation. 1-0 banked hard, smoke trailing from its wing, colliding with another in the confusion. The second launcher fired a moment later, scattering fragments that flashed like sparks in the sunlight. To those watching from the ground, it looked like the Wildcat was breathing fire from beneath its wings. The Japanese pilots broke formation, their tight precision dissolving into panic. One dove too sharply and clipped the treetops. Another pulled away completely, climbing for safety. The rest circled wide, confused by a weapon they couldn't identify. It wasn't machine gun fire, it wasn't flak, it was something invisible and immediate, an explosion of air that didn't belong in the manuals they'd studied. The ground crews below cheered, their voices rising over the fading engine noise. Domingo didn't cheer. He just stood still, his hands trembling, watching the Wildcat turn through the smoke and disappear behind the clouds. When the plane returned 20 minutes later, its landing gear nearly buckled from the strain. King was grinning through exhaustion. 3 confirmed hits, he said, sliding down from the cockpit. 2 went down, 1 spun out over the ridge. His voice cracked when he laughed, the sound somewhere between triumph and disbelief. Domingo reached up to touch the scorched edge of the launcher, feeling the warmth still radiating from the barrel. It had survived. They both had. That night, the camp didn't sleep. Mechanics gathered around the weapon, measuring, sketching, and arguing about how to replicate it. Someone suggested naming it after Domingo, but he refused. "It's not mine," he said softly, staring into the fire. "It belongs to anyone who still looks up when the sky burns." The men nodded, and for the first time in months, their laughter carried a different weight, not the brittle humor of survivors, but the sound of men beginning to believe in the impossible again. When dawn came, the valley was quiet except for the faint echo of wind moving through the hills. The ground was still scarred, the air still heavy with smoke, but something in the silence had changed. For the first time, the war didn't feel one-sided. For the first time, the sky had hesitated. Within days of the first confirmed kills, the rumor of the farmer cannon spread faster than any official report could follow. Pilots whispered about it over mess tins of cold rations. Engineers traded sketches, scribbled on ration wrappers, and mechanics began copying the crude design using whatever materials they could find. In the jungles of Mindoro, a squadron of Filipino guerrillas welded pipes to the frames of captured trucks, calling them ground breathers. On Leyte, an old American crew chief used bicycle pumps to pressurize a makeshift launcher mounted on a jeep. Everywhere the air war touched, men with no resources and no authorization were suddenly inventing new ways to make the sky bleed. What had begun as a single man's stubborn act of defiance became a pattern, a contagious form of rebellion that turned fear into creativity. The regular army hated it. Reports filed to headquarters described unregulated field modifications and mechanical anomalies compromising safety. But those words carried little meaning to soldiers who had already buried half their friends. For them, the new weapon wasn't about following orders, it was about proving that ingenuity could wound an empire. Domingo's sketches, once drawn on scraps of paper, were copied dozens of times and carried by couriers through the mountains. Some versions were accurate, others replaced valves with bamboo plugs or used kerosene instead of compressed air. None were identical, yet all shared the same heartbeat. Desperation turned into design. By mid-September, the Japanese pilots began reporting strange bursts of air pressure near their formations, invisible shockwaves that disrupted their dives. Intelligence officers dismissed these accounts as pilot error or turbulence, but the evidence piled up too quickly to ignore. Photographs from reconnaissance flights showed debris scattered in patterns impossible for anti-aircraft shells. Radio intercepts captured fragments of panicked calls describing phantom guns hidden in the clouds. The term spread across the squadrons like a ghost story, the breath of Luzon. Meanwhile, Domingo worked tirelessly to improve the weapon's reliability, refining the shape of the barrel and calibrating the pressure release with scavenged gauges. Each adjustment cost him something: sleep, time, blood. His hands were covered in cuts that refused to heal, his clothes perpetually stained with oil and soot. Yet the exhaustion didn't dull him, it sharpened him. He began to understand that what he had built wasn't just a weapon, it was a language of survival, one that anyone could speak if they dared to ignore the rules. The more others copied his design, the less control he had over it, and strangely, that was what made it powerful. The Americans finally took notice after the 44-day campaign. 26 confirmed Japanese aircraft had been destroyed across multiple islands, many by units that technically didn't exist. Each report credited a different version of the cannon: air pressure launchers, ground jets, improvised flak tubes. But the pattern was clear. Something impossible was working. Headquarters sent inspectors to verify the claims, expecting superstition, and instead found wreckage of Zeros with holes torn through their underbellies, the metal edges curled outward as if struck by invisible claws. The officers demanded to see the device. Domingo led them to his workshop, where the latest prototype sat covered in soot and dust. When they saw it, a warped pipe mounted on a wooden frame, they didn't know whether to laugh or salute. One engineer asked where he had learned aerodynamics. Domingo shrugged. "From water," he said simply. "It moves the same way." The officer stared at him for a long time before writing in his notebook. Subject appears unaware of the theoretical basis of his invention, yet replicates results consistently. That night, as the officers radioed their findings back to command, the men in the camp celebrated quietly. They had no medals, no promises, and no certainty that the war would end soon. But they had proof that intelligence could fight back against superiority. Domingo sat apart from the noise, staring at the outline of his launcher silhouetted against the firelight. It looked monstrous now, heavier than he remembered, as if it carried all the anger and hope of those who had touched it. He realized then that inventions, like wars, rarely belonged to the men who started them. They belonged to whoever needed them most. When dawn came again, the horizon was calm, painted gold by the rising Sunday. Somewhere beyond that calm, the next wave of Zeros waited, engines purring, wings glinting. Domingo stood, feeling the weight of his creation settle in his chest like gravity. The sky no longer terrified him. It was merely another machine, flawed, predictable, and breakable. By late October 1942, the farmer cannon was no longer a rumor whispered among desperate pilots. It had become a classified curiosity in the official reports of the U.S. 5th Air Force. Headquarters wanted proof real, measurable, photographic proof that an untrained mechanic and a rice farmer had somehow altered the balance of the Pacific Air War. They sent 2 engineering officers and a photographer to Luzon, expecting to find either superstition or sabotage. What they discovered instead looked like the wreckage of a miracle held together with rust and conviction. The officers arrived in a jeep covered in dust, stepping out into the stifling heat of the jungle airfield. The runway was little more than a scar of compacted dirt, its edges littered with burned metal and broken glass. They found Domingo kneeling beside a pile of pipes, his hands black with grease, his face lined from exhaustion. When the senior engineer introduced himself, Domingo wiped his palms on his trousers and said, "If you came for blueprints, I don't have any." The drawings burn faster than the planes fall. The officer didn't laugh. He simply pointed to the launcher mounted beneath a battered Wildcat and asked if it could fire. Domingo nodded once. They ran the test at dawn. The engineers watched from behind a sandbag wall, while Sergeant King piloted the Wildcat down the short strip, the twin cannons gleaming with condensed dew. The roar of the engine drowned every other sound, until King's voice crackled over the radio, calm and steady as a prayer. Pressure steady, releasing valve. The first blast split the air with a sharp concussion that echoed across the valley. A target balloon half a mile away burst into shreds. The second shot followed a few seconds later, ripping through a suspended oil drum and leaving it swinging wildly from its cables. The photographers caught everything, the smoke, the shrapnel, the grin spreading across King's face. When the plane rolled to a stop, the officers approached silently, inspecting the barrels with careful hands. The pressure regulators held firm, the seams intact. One of them muttered something about uncontrolled air compression, while the other simply wrote a single line in his notebook. Operational at low altitude. Repeatable results confirmed. They didn't understand how it worked. Not completely, but the evidence was impossible to deny. That afternoon, they sent a coded transmission back to command describing a novel improvised anti-aircraft mechanism utilizing compressed air and repurposed materials, effective within 500 feet. It was the first time Domingo's invention had ever been described in technical language, and even then, it sounded more like disbelief than praise. In the days that followed, the officers dismantled one of the cannons for study, photographing every piece before shipping it to an engineering depot in Darwin. The report that accompanied it was brief and clinical, but the final sentence stood out like a spark in a pile of ash. This device, though primitive, demonstrates an unorthodox approach to aerial defense that warrants further examination. Within a week, copies of the report reached aircraft engineers in Brisbane, Hawaii, and California. Each reader reacted the same way, first laughter, then silence, then a slow, cautious curiosity. Back in Luzon, Domingo continued to work as if nothing had changed. He didn't know about the reports or the transmissions. He only cared that the next batch of launchers needed to be ready before the next raid. But the men around him had started to look at him differently now. They saluted when they passed, not out of protocol, but out of something closer to gratitude. Even the commander, who had once called the weapon suicide, ordered his staff to give Domingo whatever materials he needed. "If insanity works," he said, "then maybe we've been sane for too long." By early November, new prototypes began to arrive from other islands, refined, polished, and marked with serial numbers. They were cleaner, stronger, and safer. Yet none of them carried the rough, human rhythm of the original. Domingo would walk past them, running his fingers along the smooth barrels, and feel nothing. His own version was still dented, still ugly, still marked with the fingerprints of men who had built it by hand. But to him, that imperfection was its truth. The proof that desperation, not doctrine, had made it fly. When the engineers departed, one of them left behind a typed note folded inside a field manual. Domingo found it weeks later. It read, "Sometimes innovation doesn't begin in a lab. It begins with someone who refuses to stop fixing broken things." He folded the paper carefully, slid it into his pocket, and went back to work, the hum of the compressor rising behind him like a heartbeat that refused to fade. By the spring of 1943, copies of the report titled Compressed Air Launch Mechanism, Luzon Prototype, had reached the engineering desks of the U.S. Army Air Force's technical divisions across the Pacific. The document was short, almost dismissive, but within its faded typewritten pages lay something that caught the attention of the right minds. A diagram of airflow compression around a curved pipe, annotated in rough pencil, signed only D. Ramos. For weeks, teams of mechanics and scientists debated whether it was an accident, a hoax, or a primitive form of fluid dynamic amplification. The conclusion was reluctant but clear. Whatever the origin, it worked, and it worked for reasons that challenged the accepted logic of aerial defense. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers began testing scaled versions of the mechanism in controlled wind tunnels. The results astonished them. When compressed air was released through a narrow vent angled with the direction of airflow, the velocity spike produced a focused pressure wave that could disturb lightweight materials up to 30 meters away. It was crude and unstable, but the potential was undeniable. The scientists called it the Ramos Effect in their private notes, a gesture of irony that later turned into official terminology. Within months, the principle found its way into experimental blast assist pods designed for carrier-based aircraft, intended to disrupt enemy formations during low-altitude dogfights. Meanwhile, on Luzon, Domingo had no idea that his name had entered the vocabulary of aeronautical engineering. He kept repairing engines, welding scrap, and teaching younger mechanics how to read the wind before they read the gauges. Occasionally, supply officers would visit the camp asking about air pressure field devices, taking photographs and measurements of his battered prototypes. Domingo let them look but refused to sign any papers. "I didn't build it for patents," he told them. "I built it because there was nothing else to build." They always nodded, wrote something in their notebooks, and left, taking with them another piece of the story that would eventually outgrow him. By the end of the war, traces of his invention appeared in unlikely places. Navy engineers modified the principle for use in emergency runway clearers that blasted debris off carrier decks. Airborne engineers adapted the same airflow redirection system to stabilize low-altitude parachute drops. Even after the conflict ended, the airflow model derived from the Farmer cannon became a case study in several military academies, cited as an example of how necessity drives invention beyond doctrine. Few cadets who read about it ever knew that the man behind the idea had never attended a single day of formal schooling. The Americans who had fought beside Domingo eventually went home. Some sent letters that never reached him. Others sent photographs of their families and new lives built on distant shores. Domingo stayed behind, repairing tractors, fixing pumps, and occasionally helping rebuild the same fields that war had once turned to ash. When journalists visited the village years later, they found him barefoot in the mud, hammering a bent pipe back into shape. They asked him about the weapon, about how he had designed it. He smiled faintly and said, "It was never a weapon. It was a question, what if the sky could listen?" Across the ocean, in laboratories filled with polished aluminum and fluorescent light, engineers ran simulations of airflow turbulence, using equations that bore his initials. The Ramos principle was taught as part of a lecture on unconventional weapon design, not as a miracle, but as a mathematical phenomenon. In the margins of the textbooks, someone had written the same phrase Domingo once scrawled on his first sketch: "Hang in Laban, hang in air against air." History, as it always does, reduced his story to a line in a report, a footnote between dates and names. Yet every pilot who ever flew through a turbulence avoidance system, every mechanic who improvised under pressure, owed something to that stubborn farmer who refused to accept that gravity and doctrine were unbreakable laws. And though Domingo would never see his name etched into any medal or monument, his fingerprints lingered in every gust of wind that carried a plane safely home. The war ended the way storms end suddenly, without ceremony, leaving behind silence heavy enough to feel like disbelief. The planes stopped coming, the smoke faded from the hills, and the sky, once a hunting ground of fire and steel, became blue again. Domingo Ramos watched it clear day by day, unsure whether to feel relief or suspicion. After years of expecting death to fall from above, peace felt like an unfamiliar machine whose purpose he no longer trusted. He returned to his fields, repaired the irrigation pumps, and planted rice in soil still black with ash. The first time the water flowed again, he wept, not for victory, but because the sound reminded him of engines climbing through the clouds. Years passed, and the world forgot the desperate men who had fought the war with tools instead of weapons. The factories came back, the textbooks filled with clean equations, and the medals went to names printed neatly in reports. Domingo's story, like the invention itself, dissolved into rumor, then myth. Some said he had built a secret cannon that used sound. Others claimed it was steam or lightning. No one remembered that it was just air, simple, invisible, and free. When foreign journalists visited the village decades later, they found an old man with oil-stained hands sitting beside a rusted tractor, carving spare parts from scrap metal. They asked what he thought about the war that had made him famous. He smiled faintly and said, "I never fought a war. I fixed a problem." In Manila, at a small military museum, one of his original launchers was displayed behind a sheet of glass, mislabeled as improvised ground flak tube, unknown origin. The placard listed no inventor, no date, no story, only dimensions and weight. Visitors passed it without looking twice, yet those who lingered long enough could see the faint letters still etched into the side of the barrel, almost erased by rust. Hang in Laban, hang in air against air. The words glimmered in the light like a private confession, the only trace of a man who had once dared to make the wind fight back. Domingo lived long enough to see his grandchildren play in fields that no longer trembled with gunfire. He taught them how to listen to the rhythm of the pumps, how to follow the flow of water without forcing it, how to respect the patience of machines. When they asked if he had really built something that shot down airplanes, he shook his head. "No," he said. "I built something that made people think differently. That's harder." They laughed, but he didn't correct them. Children should believe in stories before they learn about history. In the final years of his life, he grew deaf from years of working near compressors, yet he still claimed he could feel the air move around him like an old friend. Sometimes, when the wind changed direction, he would pause, tilt his head, and say softly, "It remembers." To those who heard him, it sounded like the rambling of age, but in that whisper was the same stubborn truth that had kept him alive and understanding that the world bends only for those who dare to push against it. When he died, there were no medals, no ceremonies, only the quiet hum of a generator running somewhere in the distance. The men who had fought beside him were gone. The machines they built turned to rust, but his idea had already taken flight far beyond the reach of names or nations. Every aircraft that cut through turbulence, every engineer who solved a problem no one else understood, carried a fragment of his defiance. History would call it an invention. Domingo would have called it survival. In the end, his story became less about a weapon and more about a truth, too simple for theory. Sometimes the most foolish idea in the hands of a determined man is the one that teaches the sky how to listen.